All right, today we are tackling one of the wildest stories in all of history. Seriously. It's about how a private company run by a handful of investors in London somehow ended up conquering an entire country.
Okay, so let's just dive right in. Because the main question here is, well, it's pretty mind-boggling, isn't it? How on earth did a group of businessmen and shareholders working out of a tiny office in London manage to build an empire, command a huge army, and rule over millions of people thousands of miles away? It's a story of ambition for sure, but also of innovation and just brutal exploitation.
So, where did this all start? You gotta go all the way back to December 31st, 1600. Queen Elizabeth I gives a royal charter to a bunch of merchants. And their goal? It wasn't about conquest, not at first anyway. No, it was pure capitalism. They wanted a piece of that incredibly lucrative spice trade in the East Indies, and their whole setup was built around one thing and one thing only: making money for their investors.
To really get how they rose so high, so fast, we have to look at their business model. Because honestly, it was revolutionary for the time, and it basically laid the groundwork for what we think of as the modern corporation.
You see, the East India Company was, on a massive scale, a joint stock company. And this was an absolute game changer. Instead of just one super rich person funding a very risky voyage, they could pool money from hundreds, even thousands of different investors. So if a ship sank or a voyage went bust, no single person was ruined. Everybody shared a little bit of the risk, and everyone shared the potential for massive rewards.
Let's break this down with a really simple analogy. Imagine 10 friends want to start a lemonade stand. Each of them puts in $10. That idea that you can only risk what you put in, that's called limited liability, and it was the cornerstone of their whole model. Now, if the stand is a huge hit and makes $200, everyone gets $20 back. That's their dividend. The East India Company was doing exactly this, but, instead of lemonade, they were dealing in silks and spices and opium and doing it on a global scale.
So what made putting your money into this company so irresistible? Well, it was really three things. First, that royal charter gave them a government-backed monopoly. No other English company could legally trade in Asia. It was all theirs. Second, the whole financial setup was genius. You could only lose what you put in, and the dividends were consistently amazing. And finally, and this is so important, a lot of the shareholders were also members of parliament. This created this powerful lobby inside the government that could get them political and military support whenever they needed it.
So you have this potent mix of cash and political muscle. And that sets the stage for a truly shocking transformation. The company was about to pivot, shifting from just a trading firm to a full-blown territorial empire.
And get this shift, it happened incredibly fast. The mid-18th century was the real tipping point. The wars they were fighting against their French rivals jacked up their military presence. And then, in less than a decade, you have two huge, decisive battles, Plassey and Buxar, that seal their control. And it all leads to a treaty that officially turns them from traders into rulers.
The Battle of Plassey is often painted as this great military victory. But the truth? It was much more about cloak and dagger stuff. It was really a masterclass in political manipulation. The company's commander, a guy named Robert Clive, cooked up this whole conspiracy with Mir Jafar, who was a disgruntled general for the Nawab of Bengal. Clive promised to make him the new ruler if he'd just betray his own side on the battlefield. Immediately after that battle, the company and its officials basically emptied Bengal's treasury. They extracted this staggering sum, calling it reparations. But let's be real here. This wasn't profit from trade. This was straight up plunder, and it was going to change everything.
Just to give you an idea of what that means, that's over $450 million in today's money. This massive flood of cash single-handedly paid for the company's private army. It allowed them to grow bigger, stronger, and to crush their rivals. Profit wasn't just coming from trade anymore, it was being generated by conquest.
The last piece of the puzzle fell into place in 1765. After another big win at the Battle of Buxar, the Mughal emperor, who was pretty weak by this point, was forced to grant the company Diwani rights. This essentially gave a private corporation the legal authority to collect all the taxes from millions of people in India's richest regions. It was official. A private company had become a government.
But this kind of unprecedented corporate power, well, it came at an unimaginable human cost. The relentless drive for shareholder profit was about to lead to one of the greatest tragedies of the 18th century.
This table really just lays it all out. Cause and effect. The company's policies were absolutely ruthless. They jacked up land taxes like crazy to maximize revenue, which forced farmers to grow cash crops like indigo and opium instead of food. Then, they flooded the market with cheap British goods, completely destroying India's world-famous textile industry. It was a systematic draining of wealth out of India and straight into Britain.
And this wasn't just some economic disruption. We're talking about mass death. During the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, an estimated 10 million people died. A third of the population just gone.
And let's be crystal clear about this. This was not a natural disaster. The famine was a direct result of the company's policies. They had forced farmers to stop growing rice and start growing cash crops, and then they kept collecting taxes with brutal efficiency, even as a third of the population was literally starving to death. It was a man-made catastrophe, fueled entirely by corporate greed.
This quote from our sources just hits the nail on the head. Every single policy decision was made with one goal in mind: squeeze as much value as possible for the shareholders back in London, no matter what the human cost was on the ground in India.
A company that's built on that level of exploitation, you just know it can't last, right? Decades of resentment were simmering just below the surface. And in the middle of the 19th century, it all finally boiled over.
So what was the spark? You might be surprised. It was a new rifle cartridge. See, to load the rifle, soldiers had to bite the end off the cartridge, and a rumor started spreading like wildfire that the grease they used on these cartridges was made from cow and pig fat, which is, of course, deeply offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers in the company's army. This single act of what seems like cultural carelessness just ignited a firestorm.
And this is so telling, the event itself goes by two totally different names, and that really shows you the huge divide in how it was seen. The British called it the Great Mutiny, which frames it as a betrayal by their own soldiers. But for many Indians, it was the first war of independence, a unified uprising against a foreign, oppressive ruler. The rebellion was vast, it was violent, but in the end, it was crushed with extreme brutality. And in the aftermath, the British government back in London came to a pretty stunning conclusion. This whole experiment was over. A private, for-profit company simply could not be trusted with governing an empire anymore.
And the end came fast. The rebellion kicks off in 1857. Just 1 year later, in 1858, the Government of India Act is passed, stripping the company of all its power and transferring it directly to the British Crown. A few years after that, in 1874, the company that once ruled a subcontinent was formally dissolved. It just ceased to exist, becoming a relic of a past era.
And this slide sums up the transition perfectly. 1858 wasn't the end of British rule in India. Not at all. It was the end of corporate rule. It marked the official start of the British Raj, where India was governed directly by the British state all the way until its independence in 1947.
So we end up right back where we started, thinking about the mind-boggling power of a private company. The East India Company completely blurred the lines between a boardroom and a government, between shareholder value and actual statecraft. Its story is an extreme, historical example, of course, but it leaves us with a pretty vital question for our own time. What are the lines between corporate influence and government power now? And who's drawing them?